مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. اللجنة العليا المسؤولة عن السياسة الخارجية ضمن حكومتنا هي مجلس الأمن القومي. بموجب القانون يضم أعضاء مجلس الأمن القومي الرئيس، نائب الرئيس، وزير الخارجية، وزير الدفاع، ووزير الخزانة. هؤلاء الخمسة يصنعون القرارات المتعلقة بالحرب والسلام وأمن دولتنا. لكن في نظامنا الحكومي تشمل القرارات المتعلقة بالسياسة الخارجية أطرافاً فاعلة أكثر بكثير من هؤلاء الخمسة، كذا من إدارات ووكالات أخرى، زعماء من الكونغرس، زعماء من خارج الحكومة مثل كبار الصحفيين، كبار رجال الأعمال، والأعضاء جماعات الضغط ذوي النفوذ، بل وحتى المشاهير المعنيين بالقضايا معينة. قارنوا معي من يخضع باهتمام أكبر: جورج كلوني وأنجلينا جولي، سيناتور ما، وأحد أعضاء الكونغرس. الإجابة واضحة. في هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن سنتحدث عن الأطراف الفاعلة المختلفة في عملية صنع السياسة الخارجية، وكيف تؤثر على نتيجة القرارات المحورية مع اللجنة المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. By law, there are only 5 members of the National Security Council: the President, the Vice President, and the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury. But there are a lot of other people and institutions in Washington who play a central role in the making of national security and foreign policy. And we're going to talk about those people and institutions today with our guests. So, gentlemen, inside government, bureaucracies, whether it's the state bureaucracy, defense, intelligence community, who really has influence on the most important national security decisions, and how do they wield that influence? Dennis?
You know, it's not consistent. It depends upon different administrations. In administrations that are White House dominated, the fact is the different bureaucracies can only, in effect, try to influence things by trying to influence what the White House is going to decide. In other administrations where, in fact, you don't have that kind of White House domination, very much depends upon, all right, who are the cabinet officials and are they seen as kind of the lead player or not? Again, going back to the Bush 41 administration, George H.W. Bush administration, this was not a White House-driven administration, not in national security. Even though George H.W. Bush was seen as a foreign policy president, the driver was actually the State Department, much more than any other one, and that had a lot to do, I think, with the weight of the Secretary of State. In the Obama administration, it is a White House-driven administration, so there isn't a single cabinet official who has that kind of weight. You, in a sense, see the president as a decision maker, and the processes, the interagency processes that are driven by the White House determine, in a sense, what the policies are going to be. Different cabinet officials will have to make a judgment: how do I play in that kind of a setting? I watched Hillary Clinton read the landscape in the Obama administration, realize that she would have to work things differently than she thought she might have, and over time she became a much more significant player in terms of being able to influence what the policies were going to be. But she had to kind of pick and choose her issues, and she had to pick and choose her time, and she had to build her stock in the White House to be effective at that.
And how does this process, how did it work out in the Bush administration from what you saw?
Well, Dennis is absolutely right. Each president decides how the mechanics of the national security decision-making process will work and how influence is then shared or used and leveraged. In the Bush administration, you had 2 dynamics happening. It was clear that the president was the decider, as he always liked to call himself. He was making decisions. But it was also clear that he wanted to ensure that power devolved to the cabinet secretaries, that there was a clear sense that the national security staff, the bureaucracy of the National Security Council itself, was not going to be running operations or making decisions, but instead that was what his appointed cabinet was supposed to be doing. So the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, those positions and those people were given the responsibility to drive policy. Now, as Dennis said, much of this tends to, over time, sort of revolve around the president. And so over time, key decisions, key policies, key crises eventually draw back to the White House. And so the question then is, who around the president has not only the president's ear, but has the ability to influence policy, to shape strategy, and then to help execute? And in most cases, that's usually the national security advisor, him or herself. That's usually somebody with great stature, somebody who is trusted by the president, and trusted then also by the cabinet to choreograph national security policy. And it's precisely because the president has primacy in foreign policy and national security that much of this depends on how the president, him or herself, wants to shape the national security of the United States.
All right, so this is inside the executive branch. What role, if any, on serious issues does Congress play, and when does Congress get to play it? I mean, administrations try to keep Congress out, administrations try to embrace it and get buy-in. How does that process work? Why don't I start with you, Juan?
Well, I think that Congress plays a role, several roles. I think first and foremost, Congress has an oversight and funding role. And so Congress is very much involved in foreign policy, in some ways the day-to-day, because they have to oversee the functioning, for example, of the State Department, or approve the budget of the Defense Department. And so the committees in Congress are actively involved in the programmatics and budgeting of the national security complex itself. So that's a key role of Congress. But that's a less formative and active role, I would say, and that's more kind of maintenance. You then have Congress in particular areas trying to perhaps constrain or impact the way an administration's doing its work. And so you've seen that with the Obama administration, with Congress getting more and more involved in affecting the way the Obama administration executes, for example, the war on terror policy. Restrictions on the release of detainees from Guantanamo is a good example of that. So Congress begins to constrain and shape policy options for the executive, which the executive will then push back on. Right. And then finally, sort of at moments of tension or crisis, Congress then plays a role in reviewing. So after 9/11, for example, or after the WMD failures of intelligence in Iraq, Congress then plays a role of reviewing, modifying, instituting new laws and institutions in the government, and so in some ways has a role in reshaping. So, for example, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11 with the administration's support, and so Congress can reshape the very complex of national security. So I think it's in those three ways that you see Congress playing a role. And sometimes this is personality dependent. If you have particular leaders on Capitol Hill who are interested in particular areas, have a leadership position on a key committee that oversees budget or operations, they then, with their own force of will and their position, can have an outsized role for Congress in foreign policy.
I think Juan has described it quite well. Congress is more of a constraint. Congress can't initiate, and any president is going to want to preserve the executive powers that go with the presidency, particularly when it comes to national security. But it is a constraint, and you take, for example, something like dealing with Iran right now and trying to negotiate an agreement with Iran. You have legislatively mandated sanctions. The Iranians want the sanctions rolled back. Those that are within the power of the presidency, meaning executive orders, he can revoke on his own. But if you have legislatively mandated sanctions, for those to be lifted, the Congress is going to have to go along and do that. Now, I can tell you again, different experiences. When I was our negotiator in the Middle East, I had very few constraints in terms of what I could do from a negotiating standpoint. But I also knew at different points that if we were going to have an agreement and we were going to need congressional support and we would need funding for it, we would have to have support from the Hill. Before we had a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, one of the things that we were able to do in response to the King of Jordan being prepared to meet with the Prime Minister of Israel for the first time, he wanted to have debt relief. Now, at the time, the cost of debt relief had gone up. It wasn't, it was a dollar for dollar accountability that you had to be able to produce. For every dollar that you were forgiving, you had to, in a sense, you had to account for it. And I literally, at the time that we had the king going up to the Hill to make a speech to the joint sessions of Congress, before he spoke, I was on the floor of the Congress, speaking to the leaders of both parties together, explaining the significance of the meeting we just had, the significance of what he was about to say to them, and how important debt relief was. And this was a critical part of what we needed to be able to continue to pursue what we then, in 3 months' time, produced was a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan.
Just a quick point on the Iran debate, because this is an interesting role for Congress as well, which is slightly different. Where Congress wants to be more active on an issue like Iran or Iran sanctions, they can, especially in the hands of a master negotiator like Dennis Ross, Congress and its views can become an actor in diplomacy and in the negotiations. And so in the Iranian context, for example, the threat that Congress may impose additional sanctions may be harsher than what the State Department or the President is expressing diplomatically, can often be a help or could be a hindrance to diplomacy. But that's a role that Congress can play, and can often play that merely with its voice as opposed to anything mechanically.
Okay, but when we come back, we'll continue this congressional discussion and then talk about other players, the media, special interests, even, God forbid, the views of the American people. Again, our panelists are Juan Zarate. Juan is the senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. In the administration of President George W. Bush, he served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. He was also, earlier in that administration, the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. His experience is the subject of a new book called Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, served 3 years in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Okay, speaking of domestic support, let's first ask about a question I'm sure many of our viewers are interested in, which are special interests, lobbies, groups of Americans who come together because they share a concern about a certain issue. Not general public opinion, but activists. In your experience, to what extent do these groups really play a role in the shaping and formation of foreign policy?
I think interest groups across the board, whether you're talking about foreign policy or otherwise, can have influence in Washington, certainly do. Lobbyists throughout town meet with members of Congress to try to influence and shape their views. They propose legislation, they actually draft it at times, and certainly meet with administration officials to shape the way that they're thinking about issues. And so there's no question they can impact. But despite sort of the lore that's out there, these groups, whether it's Cuban American groups on Cuban policy or Jewish American groups on issues of the Middle East, I don't think they drive the principal policies. I think they can affect in particular moments on maybe particular issues, but the broad policy is really not determined by these groups. These groups are powerful, and they can be powerful because of the influence on Congress in particular. And where they may represent voting interests, especially in places like Florida with the Cuban American lobby. But that said, I think the lore that these groups are the puppeteers of American foreign policy is just not true and not accurate, though you have to understand that they do have influence.
Dennis? I think that's very fair. Again, I think it comes back to understanding who initiates, who formulates policy, and that's done within the executive branch. So constraints can be imposed on the outside where, again, Congress has the ability to, if it's a question of funding, Congress can determine whether or not you get the funding. So there is a capacity to affect what the administration does, but it's more in the realm of constraining what it does than in terms of influencing what it can do. The initiation is coming typically from the executive branch, and that really shapes the policy. If a policy is one that has to be sustained over time, to be sure, the administration will be mindful of the role that certain lobbyists can play. It'll be mindful particularly of the impact they can have on the Hill, but it's also a two-way street. Oftentimes those very lobbies, the administration will go and they will talk to those lobbyists first, and they'll actually use those lobbies as a lobby on the Hill, because they'll see it as a way of being able to carry out a policy and to sustain it.
Let me ask more broadly about public opinion. Major national security issues, to what extent is the president looking over his shoulder and reading polls about what the American people would like to see? And to what extent is he checking to see whether his leadership is registering support in the American people? And you know, this dynamic between popularity and leadership. Dennis?
Well, first of all, I'm reminded of an old saying. Vernon Walters used to say, anybody who says that flattery will get you nowhere has never been flattered. Anybody who thinks that any president doesn't pay attention to the polls is dreaming. Every president is paying attention to the polls. Now, does that mean that's what guides them in policy? No, it depends upon the president. But they're always aware of what the polls are suggesting. The presidents who are most successful are the ones who will look beyond that and who will realize, look, it's the results that are going to affect the polls.
All right, so who read the polls the most?
I think all of them read the polls. But I'll give you one example. President Clinton was the one who had more of a capacity to look beyond the polls than anybody that I worked for. He was one who was very mindful of them, and he had pollsters who were very close to him, but he was constantly looking beyond them and saying, okay, I get that's what it is, but what he used it more as an indicator of, what do I have to affect? What do I have to change? How do I have to get beyond this? And I remember very vividly, I mean, it's an interesting story. When we were first at Shepherdstown in trying to negotiate between the Israelis and the Syrians, at one point it was pretty clear that Ehud Barak was reluctant to take certain steps because he decided, after having gone to Shepherdstown, that the polling within Israel suggested doing a deal on Syria was more daunting than he may have thought. And I recall sitting with the president when he was saying to Barak, look, what's going to matter here is the results. I get that this is really a hard problem for you, but I'm just telling you, whatever the polls are, they're not enduring. Your results will be enduring, and that's what you'll be able to sell. And I remember him saying to Barak, I got a lot of experience as a politician. You have much less as a politician. I'm just telling, trust me on this, results matter more than polls.
One?
I think polls are used as a proxy for political capital, and I think that's what presidents, at least that's my experience, in particular President Bush, he wasn't necessarily worried one day to the next, you know, what's the approval rating. In some ways, he didn't care about that, but what he did care about was political capital to be able to drive and make decisions. And in some ways, that's most important in the domestic context for domestic policy. But in foreign policy, I think Dennis is absolutely right, that a president is faced with the question of, do I have support for an approach? And you see this debate happening now in the United States, and in particular with the Obama administration. The question of, what is the mood in America? Are we able to intervene? Are we able to project power at a time when it feels like Americans want to return home and don't want a muscular foreign policy? And so there's a struggle there for what is the environment publicly for policy. But Dennis is right as well, because I think the role of the president, and you've seen this time and again, that a president will often drive opinion with decision making. And I think, frankly, that's one of the criticisms of the recent Syrian red line debate, the question of whether or not the president was reading the polls too much, relying too much on sort of understanding the political environment and the fact that there wasn't a lot of public support for this, as opposed to saying there are actions that we should take as a matter of principle and that are right for our foreign policy, and the right foreign policy and the right results will actually drive popularity and build capital. And so I think that's the calculus that happens in the Oval Office. You saw this, by the way, with George W. Bush. At the moment of great crisis on Iraq, the Iraq War was not going well. We were losing. In fact, members of Capitol Hill saying, we've lost.
Yep.
There was bipartisan consensus that we simply needed to withdraw. The best and brightest of the American intelligentsia, the Iraq Study Group, saying it's time to leave. President Bush, despite the numbers, despite the lack of popularity, made a very unpopular decision and moved with the surge. And I think history has shown and will continue to show that that was the right policy decision. It was a turning point, at least for the United States at that moment, and may have, in fact, saved American foreign policy in that moment and for years to come.
Gentlemen, fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for explaining who really runs, or at least who really impacts, on the making of American foreign policy. Thank you. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثير المواطنين العاديين على صنع السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elkhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.